The Battle of Adwa. That has been your recent book, right? And I think
Yes, yes, that's
I've
my
been
new
seeing
book,
it a
right?
lot around. And for the people who are listening right now, they should definitely know it's a book that you just published, and they should definitely get a copy. It's an amazing book. And I like the fact that you are trying to cover what is hidden or at least left out in history, because
Yes,
those are usually the most important moments that we need to help us really understand what we are capable of.
absolutely. And we don't know our history because we don't even teach our history, which is very disappointing, actually. Um, we don't realize that we can only achieve when we know who we are and we know that we have value. And that's not the case, unfortunately, in many African countries, you know. If you go to India, there's an Indian identity. They're not ashamed of that, right? If you go to China, there's a Chinese identity. They're not ashamed of that. In fact, that is the reason why they're achieving economically now, because they're not trying to ape the West. They're not copying the West. They're building China, knowing that they are people with a long history of achievement. There was some disruption and interruption when China was dominated at some point by the West. But China has recovered its sovereignty. And since the Chinese Revolution has been building China, that is why China is an emerging, preeminent power, while on the other hand, the United States is on the decline, much like Britain at one point was the preeminent power, and then Britain went on decline when the US was on the ascendancy. So I say all this suggests that we have to know our African identity and to be proud of that African identity. And it's there. It was disrupted, yes, primarily during the era of the slave regime, the enslavement of Africa. You know, people only focus on the people who are kidnapped and taken away from the continent, but they don't look at other aspects. The disruption, the internal wars that were generated, because now the wars were fought just to capture fellow sisters and brothers into captivity, because our market has been opened in the so-called New World. So the disruption in the domestic economy, the domestic trade, you know, routes that had been established, agricultural production, the best mines were taken away. Some of the ones taken away were the best agriculturalists. You know, Africans were very advanced in agriculture by that time. So the skills were taken to the new so-called New World in the Americas, whether North America or South America. But prior to that, we had a long history going back to Kemet. Look at the genius of the creations during Kemet. You know, Egypt is not an African word. Egypt is a word that came much, much later with civilizations, or rather cultures, to borrow. Walter Rodney prefers to use the word cultures, because when you say civilization, then you start equating, you know, who's more advanced, who's less advanced. So let's stick to culture. Those high levels of cultures created. Imagine the genius that it took in Kemet. Those were Africans doing this 3,200 years before Christ. Forget about that culture. Go to the much more recent cultures of Mali, of Ghana, of Songhai. Think about that. We had all of that. When you look at countries like England, they just came yesterday in the 10th century. You know, Italy, you know, just came yesterday in the 19th century, right? So we have all that foundation that I think would make a tremendous difference if Africans become not only conscious of that, but practice that, make that their persona, make that the African identity. Don't think you're inferior or secondary to anybody. So that's why we have to look at history of victories that we had, because normally the history, when you look, it's propaganda that Africa was very readily conquered by the West. There was no resistance. Basically, people just lay down and said, yeah, we are willing, we're ready to be colonized and civilized. That's all nonsense. So that's why I thought the story of Adwa was very important. When, because we're talking, this is a period during the scramble for Africa, when they had the Berlin Conference, they partitioned the continent amongst the European powers. And then Italy comes to Ethiopia, or to use the previous name that was more popular, Abyssinia. So they come to secure their empire now, their colony. And at the Battle of Adwa on March 1st, 1896, the Italian army is completely annihilated. Annihilated to the extent that the Ethiopians they kill almost 3,000 Italians and capture almost another 3,000 and march them back to Addis Ababa, the capital named by the Empress herself, Empress Taitu. And they are compelled to work under the supervision of Africans, right? So now they see how it feels when the tables are turned. They're working in enslaved-like conditions commanded by Africans for many, many months until Italy pays millions and millions in reparations before they are released. That is an important history to show how Africans fighting on the battlefield stopped white supremacy and imperialism on its track. And the white supremacy part, of course, accompanied whether it was slavery, to justify enslaving Africans, colonialism to justify colonizing Africans, saying, oh, they needed civilization. That's all white supremacy. And in the case of Italy, the commander-in-chief, General Oreste Baratieri, when he was still in Rome, promised the king, at that time Italy was still a kingdom, King Umberto, that he would come back to Rome with Emperor Menelik in a cage to be displayed, only to find out the so-called savages were not willing to cooperate in that idea. Baratieri himself ends up fleeing from the battlefield. One general is captured, 2 generals are killed, And it's so interesting that when I was doing the research and looking at some of the coverage at that time, there were some magazines that claimed Ethiopians were actually Europeans, they're white. And that's so Italy actually lost a war to fellow Europeans. They were much more willing to accept their propaganda than to accept the propaganda that they'd been defeated on African soil. I think this story should be widely known. At least all Africans should know it. All Pan-Africans should know it. Africans in diaspora should know it as well. And 2 final points. One, I gave it the title Empress Taitu and Emperor Menelik in Love and War. The Love and War part describes them as a couple with a normal loving life as a couple. The war, of course, describes that when it came to the time to fight, they had to fight together as a couple. And that's the war part. And the Empress herself had 6,000 men under her command. And she has not been given the proper recognition for her bravery in that victory. So that's why the cover of the book also displays her centrally and very prominently. And then the second point is that I had the book illustrated to give it, because most young readers now like visual, right? So that's why the book was illustrated by a brilliant artist who's actually an architecture student at Makerere University in Uganda. So he did a very brilliant artwork for the book. And of course, the book, the e-version is available on Amazon. Paperback is also going to be available on Amazon later this week. The hard copy, which I call the collector's edition, is available on a dedicated website for the book. And that website is Taitu and Menelik.com. So it's just the first name, Taitu, Taytu, and then the word and, A-N-D, and then Menelik, the emperor's name, MENELIK.com. So that's the website where people can order the hardcover. If people watching from the continent, from the motherland, from Africa, I imagine it's probably easier for them to order the e-version from Amazon.